How did families sleep peacefully on open plains where cold winds never stopped? How did they rest through freezing nights without modern beds or blankets? What simple secrets kept them warm, dry, and comfortable inside a shelter made of hides and poles? Could the way a fire was built decide whether a night brought rest or misery? And why did the position of a single doorway matter more than you think? Stay with us, because the truth behind their comfort may surprise you. Today we're exploring 10 Native American secrets for sleeping comfortably in a teepee. If you want to uncover the secrets behind sleeping comfortably in a teepee and see how traditional teepee living shaped it, subscribe now and start this journey with us before it unfolds. Watch the video to the end and you will learn how they stayed warm, dry, safe, and truly rested through the harshest nights. Across the sweeping grasslands of North America, nightfall brought sharp cold, whispering winds, and endless darkness stretching beyond the firelight. The temperature could drop without warning. Wind moved across the open land with nothing to slow it. Rain came sideways. Snow arrived silently and without apology. And yet inside the teepee, there was warmth. There was rest. There was something that can only be called home. Inside those shelters, families prepared not just to sleep, but to endure. Comfort was never accidental. Every hide, every pole, every small and deliberate movement had a purpose that had been learned not in a single lifetime, but across hundreds of them. In a world without modern shelter, without foam mattresses, central heating, or weatherproofing sprays, rest depended entirely on wisdom. Wisdom passed through generations, spoken quietly from elder to child, demonstrated through practice, refined through every hard winter and every long night spent on the open land, where comfort and survival were not two separate goals, but a single, carefully woven truth. This is that truth. Before we step inside the first teepee, it helps to understand the principles that made everything else possible. Comfort inside a teepee did not come from fighting nature. It came from understanding it, reading it, working with it the way you work with a river, not by building a dam, but by knowing which way the current runs and letting that knowledge guide every choice. Wind direction was studied carefully. Ground warmth was understood as a resource, not a given. Fire was treated as a tool requiring skill, not simply a source of heat. And the arrangement of space, who slept where, how hides were layered, which direction the door faced, was never random. The result was a system, not a complicated one, not one that required expensive materials or specialized equipment, but a deeply considered one where cold, smoke, and moisture were managed with precision and care. What you will take away from this video is an understanding of how simple positioning, natural insulation, and thoughtful daily habits created warmth, dryness, safety, and deep rest, even in some of the harshest environments on the continent. 10 secrets, each one more compelling than the last. Let's begin. The comfort of the night began before the teepee was even raised, before a single pole was driven into the earth, before a hide was unrolled, and before the fire was lit. The ground itself was evaluated, carefully, deliberately, with the kind of quiet attention that only comes from understanding how quickly the wrong choice can ruin everything. Families selected slightly elevated ground whenever it was available. Not dramatically high, not a hilltop exposed to wind, but gently raised, just enough that rainwater would drain away naturally rather than pooling beneath the structure. In a world where waterproofing came from the careful preparation of animal hides and not from modern synthetic materials, this mattered enormously. A night of heavy rain could turn low ground into a slow, cold flood, seeping upward through even the most carefully laid bedding. The texture of the ground mattered too. Soft earth and grass provided natural cushioning, a gentler surface beneath the body than hard-packed soil or rock. Rocky ground was avoided not only because it was uncomfortable, but because it retained less warmth and transferred cold more efficiently. Damp soil was similarly passed over. Cold and moisture moved together, and ground that held water would pull heat from the body through the night no matter how many hides were layered above it. This was not guesswork. It was observation passed down through generations of people who had slept outside in every condition the plains could produce. The lesson embedded in this first choice is one that resonates well beyond the plains and well beyond the teepee. Comfort starts with smart placement. Dry ground means warmer sleep. The foundation of everything that follows is the decision made before anything begins. But even on perfect ground, not even on a dry, gently elevated patch of soft earth, cold still crept in. It rose from beneath. It moved through the air. It found every gap it could. So how did they stop it? The earth itself became their first blanket. And this was not a metaphor. It was a practical, deliberate, material truth. Once the right ground had been chosen and the teepee raised, the floor was not left bare. The cold earth, no matter how dry, no matter how carefully selected, would slowly and steadily pull warmth from any body resting against it. This is simple physics, the same principle that makes sitting on cold stone uncomfortable within minutes. Heat moves from warm to cold, always, and bare ground is a patient and persistent thief of body warmth. The solution was layering. Thick, dense layers of natural material spread across the ground, each one adding another barrier between the sleeping body and the earth below. Slow close-up of grass layers, then reeds, then buffalo hides, the texture and depth of each clearly visible. Dried grass was often the first layer, pressed flat and spread evenly. It trapped pockets of air between its blades, and trapped air is warm air, the same principle used in modern insulation materials that were still centuries away from being invented. Reeds served a similar purpose, and their slight rigidity lifted the body just fractionally above the Earth's surface, creating a thin but meaningful gap. Above these base layers, animal hides were spread, thick, carefully processed, often layered one on top of another depending on the season and the expected severity of the night. Buffalo hides were particularly prized for their density and warmth. Softer hides, deer, elk, were layered beneath the body and pulled over it, surrounding the sleeper in material that was both insulating and familiar, carrying the warmth of the fire within its fibers. Think about what this represents. No factory had manufactured these materials. No machine had processed them. Every hide had been prepared by hand, scraped and stretched and dried, and worked until it was soft enough to sleep under, warm enough to hold heat through the coldest hours. The labor in those materials was immense, and their presence on the ground of a teepee was not just functional, it was evidence of work, of care, of the long chain of effort that stood between a family and the cold outside. The lesson here is foundational, and it applies to any situation where warmth matters. Insulation from below is the foundation of warmth. And cold rising from beneath is just as dangerous as cold coming from above. Address the ground first, and everything else becomes more manageable. But even with the ground fully insulated, even with thick hides creating a warm and cushioned surface, the surrounding air could still bite. The walls of a teepee stopped wind, but they could not generate heat on their own. The warmth from the ground would not be enough to carry a family through a long winter night. For that, they needed something else entirely. The real heat came from the heart of the teepee. One fire, carefully placed, could warm an entire shelter. But this was never simply a fire. It was a considered, controlled, living piece of the night's management, as important as any structural element of the teepee itself, and in many ways more demanding of attention and skill. The fire burned at the center of the teepee, positioned directly beneath the smoke hole at the apex of the structure. This placement was not incidental, it was precise. The central position allowed heat to radiate outward in all directions simultaneously, reaching every sleeping person arranged around it with roughly equal warmth. A fire placed off-center would create a hot side and a cold side, leaving some sleepers comfortable while others huddled against the night. And this fire was never large. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive detail for a modern audience raised on the image of the roaring bonfire. A large fire is dramatic and visually satisfying, but inside the confined space of a teepee, a large fire is dangerous, smokier, harder to control, and ultimately less efficient. The heat it generates rises too quickly, either escaping through the smoke hole before it can warm the space. A small, controlled fire, fed steadily and thoughtfully, generates gentle, even heat that spreads laterally rather than rushing upward. It warms the air at the level where people sleep, where it matters most. It dries damp hides without scorching them. It maintains a steady glow that the eyes and mind can rest alongside, its rhythm familiar and calming. Wide interior shot, the fire at center, hides arranged in a circle around it, the walls of the teepee glowing amber and gold. The fire also performed secondary functions that contributed directly to comfort. It dried the interior air, reducing the dampness that could accumulate in a closed shelter of living people through a cold night. It dried the hides, both the bedding and the walls. Its light pushed back the absolute darkness of the open plains at night, a darkness that could feel boundless and unsettling in the hours before sleep. In many traditions, the fire was understood as more than a practical tool. It held meaning, memory, and presence. Gathering around it was an act of community. The warmth it provided was not merely physical. The lesson it teaches is one that engineering and architecture have confirmed repeatedly across centuries. Controlled heat brings comfort, not chaos. Size is not the measure of warmth. Steadiness is. But fire, however carefully managed, creates smoke. And smoke inside a closed space is not merely unpleasant. It is genuinely dangerous, a slow and invisible threat to anyone trying to sleep through the night. So how did they breathe easily inside a closed shelter? The top of the teepee held the key to clean air and better sleep. And what was at the top of the teepee, specifically what was done to it, how it was adjusted and managed, represents one of the most elegant pieces of practical engineering in the history of portable shelter design. At the apex of the teepee, where the poles converged and the hide covering ended, there was a gap. But this gap was not a flaw or a structural oversight. It was intentional, and it was equipped with two adjustable flaps, wings of hide that extended outward from either side of the opening and could be moved independently using long poles held from the ground inside the teepee. These smoke flaps were not simply left open or closed. They were actively managed throughout the night, adjusted as wind direction shifted, as the fire changed intensity, or as weather moved through. One flap angled to catch an incoming breeze and directed over the opening could create a slight pressure differential that drew smoke upward and out with surprising efficiency. The other flap could be positioned to prevent that same wind from pushing back down into the shelter and filling it with smoke. The sophistication here is remarkable. These were not people guessing. These were people who had studied airflow, with the kind of attentive precision that comes from spending thousands of nights in these structures, observing what worked and what did not, passing those observations forward. The result was a ventilation system that functioned without moving parts, without electricity, without fans or vents or any mechanism beyond two pieces of hide on poles. The effect on sleep quality was profound. A teepee with well-managed smoke flaps allowed the central fire to burn through the night, providing warmth, drying the interior, maintaining the ambient temperature, while the air at the level where people slept remained clean. The smoke rose, the warmth stayed low. The sleepers breathed easily. A teepee with poorly managed smoke flaps was a different experience entirely. Smoke accumulation close to the ground, burning eyes, respiratory irritation. These were the consequences of inattention, which tells us something important about the people who lived this way. They were attentive. Every night, in every season, the smoke flaps required someone to understand the wind and respond to it, even in the middle of the night if conditions shifted. The lesson this secret carries forward is straightforward and powerful. Airflow control turns fire into comfort instead of discomfort. What leaves a space matters as much as what enters it. Managing output is as important as managing input. Warmth secured, fresh air secured. But outside, the wind still moved, and a teepee that was warm inside could still be made miserable by cold air, finding its way in through a poorly positioned entrance. We've just seen how warmth inside the teepee created comfort through the night. But the next step, where smoke control completely changes the story, is even more incredible. We would love to hear your opinion, so write in the comments what surprised you most so far, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next discovery. There's more to uncover, and the best secrets are still ahead. The doorway was never placed by accident. In the cultural traditions of many Plains peoples, the teepee entrance faced east, toward the rising sun, toward the direction from which morning and new light came. This orientation carried spiritual meaning, aligning the home with the movement of the world and the beginning of each day. But it was not only spiritual, it was also practical in a way that reveals the deep overlap between meaning and function in Tipi culture. On the Great Plains, prevailing winds typically move from the west. By facing the entrance east, the door was placed on the downwind side of the structure. The sheltered side, the quiet side, the side where wind pressure was lowest. This meant that when the wind pushed against the teepee from the west, it was pushing against the solid, unbroken back of the structure. And the tilted design of the teepee, slightly steeper on the windward side, more gradually angled on the leeward side, helped deflect that pressure upward rather than allowing it to destabilize the shelter. The result was remarkable structural resilience in high winds, with the geometry of the teepee itself doing much of the work. And the door on the sheltered side experienced far less wind pressure. Cold air was less likely to force its way in around the edges of the high door flap. Drafts were minimized. When someone needed to enter or leave during the night, opening and closing the door did not send a blast of freezing air across the sleeping family. The high door flap itself was designed for this purpose. Thick and heavy at the base, it hung with enough weight to press against the opening on all sides, while sealing the warmth in and the cold out. Some door covers were designed to overlap at the sides, eliminating gaps. On the coldest nights, additional hides might be hung inside as a secondary barrier, creating a short entryway space, a kind of informal airlock, that prevented the full blast of outside temperature from reaching the sleeping area when the outer door was briefly opened. The lesson here speaks to a principle that modern architecture has never abandoned. Direction matters. Shelter works best when it is aligned with nature rather than placed in arbitrary opposition to it. Knowing the land, knowing the wind patterns, knowing where the cold came from, this knowledge was built into every decision about where and how a teepee was raised. But even with the wind blocked and the door sealed, long winter nights could still grind down the warmth inside. The fire helped. The insulated floor helped. But the most efficient and reliable source of sustained warmth was one that required no additional fuel, no management, no careful adjustment of smoke flaps or door flaps. It was already inside the shelter. The arrangement of people inside the teepee created shared warmth. This seems simple, perhaps even obvious, but its implications, when examined carefully, reveal a sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics that was embedded in the daily practice of Tipi living long before the science had words to describe it. Every human body generates heat, consistently, continuously, throughout the night. In a cold environment, that heat is precious. In an open space, it dissipates quickly. But in a shared, enclosed space where bodies are arranged thoughtfully, that heat accumulates. It layers. The warmth one person generates becomes part of the ambient temperature that benefits everyone else. The circular arrangement around the fire was not arbitrary. It maximized the number of people who could be close to the fire's heat without crowding or creating a fire hazard. It distributed body warmth evenly throughout the interior space, and it kept the sleeping area away from the tipi walls. The outer perimeter where cold could still seep through, where drafts might find their way along the ground. Children and elders, those most vulnerable to cold, were positioned in the warmest spots, often closest to the fire, or sandwiched between the bodies of adults who provided both warmth and protection. This was not just practical. It was a material expression of how a community organized its care for its most vulnerable members. The combined effect of the fire's warmth and the shared body warmth of a family sleeping in a well-insulated teepee on a carefully selected and layered ground was significant. Together, these elements created what a single person sleeping alone in the same structure could not achieve. A stable thermal environment that maintained livable warmth even as outside temperatures dropped deeply. The lesson is both thermal and human. Shared space multiplies warmth and comfort. Community is not only a social arrangement. In the right conditions, it is a survival strategy. But warmth, however, it is generated and shared, is vulnerable to one particular enemy. One that is silent, invisible, and deeply undermining of everything else that has been carefully built. That enemy is moisture. Moisture was the silent enemy of comfort. Not cold exactly, though cold and moisture are close companions, each one making the other more dangerous. Not wind, which at least announced itself loudly and could be blocked by structure and direction. Moisture worked quietly, invisibly, spreading through materials that felt fine to the touch until the body pressed against them through the night and the cold began to move inward. A damp hide is not a warm hide. Water is one of the most efficient conductors of heat away from the human body. Insulation that has absorbed moisture loses its ability to trap air. And trapped air, as we have seen, is the mechanism by which natural insulation works. Press wet grass flat and it no longer holds warmth. Lay a damp fur against skin and it pulls heat outward instead of holding it in. The people who lived in tipis understood this precisely. Hides used for bedding were dried with great care before they were placed on the sleeping surface. In wet weather, the drying process required patience and attention. Hides suspended near the fire, turned and adjusted to dry evenly without scorching, checked repeatedly for dampness before being laid down for the night. Wet or damp materials. Clothing that had been worn through weather, hides that had not fully dried, were kept away from the sleeping area. They might be hung near the fire to dry, positioned so the warmth could work through them before morning, but they were not allowed to contaminate the carefully maintained dryness of the bedding. Hashorning interior shot. Damp items hung near the fire's warmth, the sleeping area visibly clear and dry in contrast. The Tipi structure itself contributed to this management of moisture. The slight gap between the outer cover and an inner lining, a secondary layer of hide hung around the interior perimeter in many Tipi traditions, served multiple purposes, but one of them was moisture management. Cold air meeting warm air creates condensation, and in a tipi without an inner lining, that condensation could form on the outer cover and run down the walls. The inner lining interrupted this process, directing any moisture that formed down along the gap between lining and outer cover toward the ground and away from the sleeping area. The lesson here is one that modern campers and cold weather hikers learn, often the hard way, every season. Dryness preserves warmth and improves sleep. Wet cold is categorically different from dry cold. Managing moisture in the sleeping environment is not a secondary concern, but a foundational one. With dryness maintained and warmth distributed, most of the night could pass in genuine comfort. But most is not all. Long winter nights stretch for many hours, and fires burn down without tending. How did warmth survive until morning? Comfort depended on watchfulness even during sleep. In a modern home, warmth arrives automatically. The thermostat does its quiet work. The furnace cycles on and off without any human awareness. The temperature in the bedroom at 2 in the morning is the same as it was at 10 at night. And it will be the same again at 5 in the morning. And no one needs to do anything to make this happen. In a teepee on the winter plains, this was not the case. The fire was the thermostat, the furnace, and the heat source all at once, and it required human attention to keep it working through the night. The practice of tending the night fire was not a burden reluctantly assigned to whoever lost an argument before bed. It was understood as a responsibility of care, for the family, for the children, for the elders who could not manage the cold that a dead fire would allow. Someone with light sleep, someone who tended to wake in the night, might naturally take on this role. Elders sometimes kept the fire through the long, early morning hours when the cold was deepest and sleep came less easily. The skill involved was not trivial. A fire fed too much wood at once would blaze up, generating excessive smoke, consuming fuel too quickly, and possibly creating a hazard in the enclosed space. A fire left too long would burn down to embers insufficient to maintain warmth. The right intervention was small and precise, a piece of fuel placed carefully, the coals adjusted to encourage even burning, the smoke flap checked to ensure the fresh fuel burned cleanly. This person moved quietly, careful not to disturb those sleeping around the fire. Their work was done with the efficiency of long practice. No wasted motion, no unnecessary light, no sound beyond the soft settling of the fire itself. The family slept. The night held. The warmth continued. The lesson embedded in this practice speaks to something more broadly true about maintenance and care. Small and consistent attention prevents large, difficult problems. A fire tended gently through the night never dies out. Comfort extended consistently through the night becomes genuine rest. The people who knew this built their nights around it. But warmth in the air, warmth from the fire, warmth shared between bodies, all of this still required something beneath and around each sleeping person to make it truly effective. What about the beds themselves? Their beds were simple, but they were surprisingly, genuinely effective. The sophistication of the Tipi sleeping system reached its most personal expression in the bedding. The materials that were arranged specifically around and beneath each individual body, designed to hold warmth, cushion the earth, and create a space where rest could actually come. The approach was layering, but layering with intention, not simply piling materials on top of one another, but selecting and arranging them according to the properties of each. The base layer was typically firm and thick, a buffalo robe or similar heavy hide that provided both cushioning and a solid thermal barrier between the body and the earth below. This base layer held its position through the night, providing a stable foundation that the sleeper could return to after movement without the bedding having shifted into disarray. Above this, softer hides were layered, each one adding insulation and comfort. The body was effectively cradled between these layers. Warmer hides beneath, a covering pulled over the top, the whole arrangement forming a sleeping envelope that trapped body heat with remarkable efficiency. The principle is identical to the layered sleeping systems used in modern cold weather camping gear, where the goal is to trap warm air in as many distinct layers as possible rather than relying on a single thick material. Where possible, bedding was slightly raised above the ground level. A low frame, or simply a sufficiently thick base of stacked hides and grass, lifted the sleeper just enough to interrupt direct cold transfer from the earth. Even through insulating materials, a raised position maintains slightly warmer air and reduces the pressure-related compression of lower insulating layers that can reduce their effectiveness through the night. The result was a sleeping arrangement that was not luxurious in the modern sense. There was no springs, no foam, no engineered comfort technology, but it was warm, genuinely cushioned, and thoughtfully designed for the specific conditions of teepee life on the open plains. People who had slept in these beds their entire lives knew their particular arrangement, their preferred combination of materials, the way the furs folded around them. The bed was personal in a way that speaks to real comfort. The lesson is one that good camping practice has always confirmed. Layering transforms simple materials into effective bedding. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and each additional layer adds disproportionately more warmth than the one below it. There was, by this point in the night, warmth enough, dryness maintained, clean air, a steady fire, comfortable bedding. Every physical element of a good night's rest had been carefully addressed. But one secret remained, and it was different from all the others. Comfort was not only physical, it was also mental. This is perhaps the most quietly profound of the 10 secrets, and in some ways the most relevant to modern life, where physical comfort is often abundant and yet restful sleep remains elusive. The people who lived in teepees understood something that sleep science has since confirmed repeatedly. Preparation and calmness create true comfort. Before sleep settled over the teepee, there was a routine, not rigid or elaborate, but consistent. A series of small, deliberate actions that moved through the space like a closing thought. Each one checking something, securing something, settling something into its right place. The fire was adjusted, brought to the steady, low-burning state that the night keeper could maintain without difficulty. The smoke flaps were set for the current wind, giving the fire the best chance of burning cleanly through the night without intervention. Clothing and tools were arranged, not scattered across the sleeping area where they might be tripped over in darkness, but placed in the positions where they would be needed in the morning. The door was checked, the bedding arranged, children settled, elders comfortable, and then the space was evaluated, not anxiously, not with a checklist and a pen, but with the settled attention of people who had done this every night of their lives and knew from that experience what a properly prepared teepee felt like. The slight sound the walls made in the wind, the way the fire sat, the quality of the air. When everything was right, and they would know if it was not, rest could come. The mind did not need to worry about the fire, not because it had been tended. The cold could not reach them, because they had prepared for it with every layer and every decision made since the teepee was first raised. There was nothing left undone that would call them back from sleep. This is what the calm of night ritual created, the conditions for trust. Trust in the preparation, trust in the structure, trust in the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever slept this way, and passed the knowledge forward. In a world without modern comfort, real rest came not from forcing the body into sleep, but from removing every reason the mind had to stay awake. When the preparation was right, sleep arrived naturally, deeply, and held through the long night until morning light began to filter through the smoke hole and the plains came slowly back to life. The lesson is ancient and utterly current. Preparation and calmness create true comfort, not just in a teepee, in any life, in any night. And now imagine living this way, every night, every season, year after year, across a landscape that gave no comfort freely and required wisdom and care to survive. Could modern comfort, with all its technology and convenience, learn something from these ancient methods? The answer may be simpler than you think. The story of 10 Native American secrets for sleeping comfortably in a teepee doesn't end here. What we've explored today is only the beginning of a much deeper world. A world where wisdom and daily life were not separated, where every material, every decision, every habit carried both practical and cultural meaning. If you want to keep exploring traditional shelter living and the hidden wonders behind sleeping comfortably in a teepee, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next chapter will reveal deeper survival wisdom behind traditional shelters. How communities prepared for extreme winter, how they traveled across vast distances while maintaining warmth and rest, and how the knowledge embedded in these ancient practices continues to influence shelter design and outdoor living today. Every discovery brings you closer to the secrets that history has kept hidden for centuries. Stay with us. The journey is far from over.